Prince Edward had spent a lifetime mastering the royal art of silence, but when he finally spoke about Catherine, his words struck deeper than praise. They reopened the most private emotional territory in the monarchy, the hidden judgments of Queen Elizabeth II. Edward did not simply call Catherine dependable or dutiful. He declared that he had never seen his mother look upon anyone with such unmistakable pride. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward understood the weight of that declaration better than almost anyone. As one of the late Queen's most observant children, he had stood close enough to witness her private reactions while remaining disciplined enough never to discuss them openly. The sovereign was the reigning monarch, but to him she had also been a mother whose approval appeared through restrained smiles, carefully chosen invitations, and rare moments of unguarded warmth. Catherine's journey had unfolded under that watchful gaze. The Princess of Wales entered royal life as a newcomer, facing relentless judgment, then slowly became a trusted senior figure responsible for major duties and the monarchy's future image. Elizabeth had observed her through public criticism, family strain, motherhood, and increasing responsibility. That history mattered because the Queen did not offer trust quickly, and she never confused popularity with character. The silence broke during a private Windsor reception honoring long-serving royal volunteers. A royal reception was a formal gathering where members of the family met guests connected to public service. With relatives, senior aides, and invited volunteers listening, Edward unexpectedly said, "I have never seen my mother proud of anyone like she is of Catherine." The statement was later preserved in a documented account prepared by an attending courtier, removing any doubt about how the revelation entered palace conversation. Catherine froze when the words were repeated to her beside the drawing room window. She first looked surprised, then visibly emotional. Praise from Edward carried unusual force, because he had known Elizabeth not merely as a sovereign, but as the woman behind the crown. He was describing something private, intimate, and impossible to manufacture. Charles said nothing. The king understood that his brother's statement could be heard as a judgment on every other royal, including himself. Edward's use of the present tense made it even more powerful. He had said the Queen is proud, not that she was, as though her approval remained alive within the institution. Sophie noticed one final detail. Before speaking, Edward had held a folded card in his hand. The trusted confidant then watched Camilla leave her chair without explanation, while he quietly returned the card to his pocket. But to understand why Edward's words unsettled the palace so deeply, one must first understand what each person in that room believed the Queen's pride was supposed to mean. Edward's declaration carried such force because he was not speaking as a distant royal observer. He was speaking as a son who knew the difference between his mother's public courtesy and her private approval. Catherine understood that distinction too. For years, she had smiled through scrutiny, humiliation, and impossible expectations without ever knowing whether the Queen saw her struggle or silently judged every step she took. Edward had occupied an unusual place inside the royal family. Unlike Charles, Anne, or Andrew, he was rarely pulled into the fiercest succession disputes, allowing him to observe Elizabeth without constantly competing for her attention. Succession meant the formal order determining who inherits the throne. But for the Queen's youngest son, distance from that rivalry gave him something rare, a clear view of what his mother truly valued. Catherine had entered that world as an outsider. The Princess of Wales faced criticism over her background, her readiness, and whether she possessed the strength required for William's future reign. Every mistake risked becoming more than a personal failure. It could be used as evidence against the man she loved, and the monarchy they would one day inherit. Catherine finally admitted the depth of that fear in a private sitting room after the reception. She told William that she had spent years wondering whether she had ever truly earned the Queen's confidence. Her voice broke when she said, Edward's words felt like an answer arriving too late. The prince reached for her hand, filled with pride but also pain. He knew recognition had finally come, yet he also understood that some relatives might resent hearing that blood alone had never guaranteed Elizabeth's highest approval. Edward faced his own reckoning that evening. Sophie found him standing alone beside the fireplace and asked why he had chosen that moment to speak. He removed his glasses slowly, folded them in his hand, and replied that silence had begun to feel like disloyalty. The trusted confidant immediately understood that her husband was doing more than sharing a memory. He was correcting the palace record. Edward believed a false narrative had taken hold, one suggesting that the late Queen's trust belonged automatically to senior rank, inherited position, or long service. In his private account, he insisted that Elizabeth had judged character under pressure, not titles alone. Catherine had earned that trust through endurance. Charles reacted with visible concern. The king asked an aide for Edward's exact wording, and twice insisted that nothing be paraphrased. He was not questioning whether the quote was accurate. He feared what his brother might reveal next. Edward then told Sophie that his mother's pride in Catherine had not begun at a grand ceremony. It began after one painful night, when the future of the family felt dangerously uncertain. That night, long buried beneath years of royal ceremony, would become the hidden trigger behind Edward's decision to finally break his silence. The Queen's deepest judgments were rarely formed beneath chandeliers or in front of cameras. They were formed in silence, after the crowds had gone and the polished smiles had disappeared. Years before Edward's declaration, one private incident forced Elizabeth to reconsider Catherine completely. It was not a coronation rehearsal, a balcony appearance, or a diplomatic triumph. It was a family crisis behind a closed Balmoral door. Elizabeth had never distrusted Catherine, but she had not surrendered her confidence easily. The Queen admired discipline, patience, and restraint, yet she remained uncertain whether the younger woman understood the emotional cost hidden beneath royal duty. Balmoral was the sovereign's private Scottish residence, a place where ceremony loosened and family character became harder to disguise. Edward noticed how closely his mother studied Catherine there, especially when no cameras, advisors, or official obligations shaped her behavior. The crisis came during a stormy evening, after Prince Philip suffered a sudden health scare. Catherine found Elizabeth sitting alone outside his room, after the doctors had entered, and the aides had withdrawn. The princess did not offer empty reassurance, or insist that everything would be fine. She simply sat beside the monarch, and remained there in silence for nearly an hour. Catherine understood that words could become another burden. When the doctor finally emerged, she stood first, but did not demand answers. The future queen stepped backward, rested one hand gently against Elizabeth's arm, and allowed her to receive the news before anyone else. In that moment, Catherine protected something the institution often forgot. The queen was also a frightened wife, waiting to hear whether her husband was safe. Elizabeth had always feared being surrounded by people who responded to the crown instead of the woman carrying it. Catherine's restraint proved she recognized both identities, without exploiting either one. She offered respect without performance, and comfort without forcing intimacy. Edward watched from the corridor. The prince later saw his mother wipe her eyes before returning to the family, and he understood that Catherine had reached a part of Elizabeth untouched by protocol. The following morning, the Queen told him privately that Catherine possessed the rare discipline of knowing when duty requires silence. He preserved that sentence in a written personal account, but never repeated it publicly. Years later, shortly before her final decline, Elizabeth mentioned the Balmoral night again. The memory had never left her. It had become central to how she judged Catherine's character and the future she might one day help protect. Edward's Windsor Declaration was therefore not spontaneous praise. It was the release of a promise connected to that final conversation with his mother. Yet when Edward prepared to reveal why that promise could no longer remain private, another member of the family confronted him before he could finish. The confrontation did not begin in front of courtiers. It began behind a locked library door, where two brothers faced each other without aides, cameras, or prepared statements. Charles wanted to know why Edward had transformed a private memory of their mother into a public declaration about Catherine. Edward wanted to know why the truth had been treated as dangerous in the first place. Neither man entered that room prepared to surrender. Charles closed the door, gripped the back of a chair, and asked whether his younger brother had intended to embarrass the family. The king believed he was the principal guardian of Elizabeth's legacy, meaning the person responsible for protecting how her reign and private wishes were remembered. To him, any claim about her personal preferences could divide relatives, weaken authority, and turn affection into a weapon. Edward refused that logic. The prince said the queen's memory had already been carefully reshaped, with endless praise for continuity, while her personal faith in Catherine was quietly reduced to polite approval. He looked directly at Charles and answered, "Telling the truth is not humiliation, unless someone has something to fear." The words struck hard. Charles accused him of turning their mother's affection into a ranking system. Edward replied that Elizabeth had never ranked her children, but she had judged character. She had watched who remained steady when pressure rose, who protected dignity without seeking credit, and who could be trusted when the monarchy felt most fragile. The king's composure finally cracked when his brother said Catherine had protected the queen during moments when others were too consumed by their own positions. No name was spoken, yet Charles heard the accusation as personal. He pushed the chair back sharply and demanded to know what Edward was really hiding. Edward then revealed the promise. He explained that Elizabeth had asked him to speak if Catherine's contribution was ever deliberately diminished after her death. The Windsor Declaration had not been reckless praise. It had fulfilled a private request, preserved in his documented account of their final conversation. Charles demanded proof. Edward reached inside his jacket and removed a small handwritten card, but he refused to surrender it. The prince said the message concerned Catherine directly, and she alone should decide whether the queen's words became public. Outside the library, Sophie heard the scrape of the chair. The trusted confidant watched William approach, and warned him quietly that the argument inside was no longer about praise, it was about ownership of Elizabeth's memory. The future king understood immediately that the card could shift loyalties across the entire family. When the door opened, Charles did not look at Edward. The monarch ordered the private secretariat, the senior office handling the sovereign's confidential affairs, to determine whether the card carried constitutional weight. The argument had begun as a clash between brothers, but within hours it would become a struggle over who possessed the authority to define the late queen's final wishes. A handwritten card could not alter the line of succession, yet everyone inside the palace understood that power was not always written into law. Sometimes it lived in memory, symbolism, and the final approval of a revered monarch. If Elizabeth had privately identified Catherine as the person she trusted most to protect the crown's character, then Edward's revelation could shift influence without changing a single constitutional rule. Charles held sovereign authority. William carried the monarchy's future. Edward possessed the private testimony, while Catherine carried the moral meaning attached to it. The line of succession was the legal order determining who inherited the throne, but this struggle existed outside that structure. It was about trust, legacy, and whose judgment would shape the family long after Elizabeth's death. The private secretariat delivered its conclusion carefully. The card had no legal force and could not grant Catherine a title, office, or constitutional power. Yet its symbolic authority was enormous, because it appeared to contain the late queen's personal assessment of her suitability for future responsibility. Symbolic authority meant influence created by public trust and moral approval, rather than formal law. Charles read those words twice. The king sat alone at his desk, placed the briefing file down, and remained motionless as the room darkened around him. He feared that releasing the message would reduce his reign to a bridge between Elizabeth and the Wales era. Catherine might become the monarchy's emotional heir, while he remained its temporary legal guardian. Camilla felt the comparison before anyone voiced it openly. The queen consort told Charles that Edward's declaration had diminished years of loyalty she had given both him and the institution. She had survived public hostility, private judgment, and endless scrutiny, yet the card created a contest she believed she could never win. Elizabeth's approval carried a sacred weight that no defense could equal. Sophie then informed William that Edward would not release the note without Catherine's permission. The trusted confidant made the balance of power unmistakable. Neither Charles nor his advisors controlled the next move. Catherine did. William soon learned something even more disturbing. Elizabeth had separately instructed Edward to protect the card from administrative reinterpretation. The phrase suggested she expected palace officials to soften, reframe, or bury her meaning after her death. Edward had preserved that warning in his documented account. Catherine finally received the sealed card inside a plain envelope. The Princess of Wales held it for several seconds but refused to open it. She said she would not read her way into a position that had to be earned through service. Her humility did not calm the crisis. It deepened it. Edward insisted silence now protected the wrong people, while Charles prepared to prevent the card from leaving Windsor. Catherine had tried to calm the storm by refusing the Queen's message, yet that very act forced every hidden fear into the open. By the next morning, Edward's tribute had ceased to be a tender family memory. It had become a fault line. Staff members whispered about the card. Senior royals questioned who had known about it. Camilla withdrew from a planned engagement briefing, while Charles demanded tighter control over all references to his mother's private correspondence. At the center stood Catherine, praised more powerfully than she had ever requested, and blamed for consequences she had never intended. Palace aides moved quickly to contain the damage. They described Edward's words as an affectionate reflection from a grieving son, rather than a statement about royal authority. Private correspondence meant letters or notes exchanged outside formal public records, but this card carried far greater emotional weight because it appeared to preserve Elizabeth's final judgment. The attempt at containment failed when witnesses repeated the exact sentence, stressing that Edward had compared the Queen's pride in Catherine with her feelings toward everyone else. Camilla received the briefing note over breakfast. The Queen consort read the quotation in silence, pushed the tray away untouched, and cancelled a private meeting before retreating to her rooms. She had spent years proving loyalty to Charles and supporting the institution, yet one sentence now threatened to reduce that service to a comparison she could never control. Catherine felt the cruelty of that comparison immediately. The Princess of Wales told William she would not allow Elizabeth's affection to become a weapon against another woman. She understood the difference between receiving recognition and benefiting from someone else's humiliation. The future king disagreed. He argued that suppressing the truth would repeat the monarchy's oldest mistake, protecting temporary comfort while destroying lasting trust. William's determination frightened her. Catherine wanted honesty, but she did not want war. Edward arrived without Sophie or aides. The prince placed the unopened envelope on the table and told Catherine that his mother's pride had never been about perfection. Elizabeth had trusted how she behaved when nobody was watching and when no reward was waiting. Then he revealed the message carried more than praise. The Queen had asked the family to seek Catherine's counsel during any future crisis of public confidence. Public confidence meant the trust people placed in the monarchy's honesty, judgment, and purpose. The instruction granted no legal power, yet it gave Catherine a moral role that could not easily be dismissed. Charles responded with an order. No private royal note could be released without sovereign approval. The king's decision directly challenged the responsibility Elizabeth had placed upon Edward and forced Catherine into the very conflict she had tried to avoid. Silence would no longer protect peace. It would allow others to define the Queen's faith in her. For the first time since Edward spoke, Catherine understood that peace would not come from stepping backward. It would come from choosing exactly what she was willing to stand for. There were no advisors in the room when Catherine finally broke the seal. No secretaries waited to interpret the language, and no cameras stood ready to record her reaction. Only Edward sat opposite her, carrying the burden of a promise he had kept for years. Catherine unfolded the card with trembling hands, expecting praise. Instead, she found a responsibility that changed the meaning of everything he had said. Catherine had asked to meet Edward privately at Windsor and insisted that neither William nor Sophie attend. She wanted to understand Elizabeth's message without pressure from the Wales household or her uncle's advisors. A royal household was the team serving one senior family member, and competing offices often turned private truth into strategy. She wanted none of that now. Edward explained that the Queen had written the card after a period of family conflict, when public confidence had weakened and private resentment threatened to overwhelm duty. Public confidence meant the trust people placed in the monarchy's honesty and judgment. Elizabeth feared that rank alone could not hold the family together if pride became stronger than service. Catherine read the first lines and stopped. She pressed the card flat against the table as tears gathered, while Edward lowered his eyes to protect her dignity. The message did not praise glamour, obedience, or popularity. It praised her for never using another person's weakness to strengthen her own position. That sentence struck with painful force. Catherine told Edward the current crisis was doing exactly that in her name. Every compliment was becoming a comparison. Every tribute to her was being used against Camilla, Charles, and anyone believed to have received less approval. She said she could not accept a legacy built on humiliation. Edward answered that Elizabeth had never asked her to defeat anyone. The prince said his mother wanted Catherine to stop the monarchy from destroying itself through pride. Then he revealed the instruction clearly. During any crisis of public confidence, her judgment should be heard before the family issued its final response, because she understood both the institution and the people trapped inside it. Catherine finally understood why Edward had spoken. He admitted that recent palace decisions had repeatedly excluded her from discussions affecting the monarchy's emotional credibility. Emotional credibility meant whether the family's public words matched the compassion people expected from it. Silence, he believed, had begun protecting procedure rather than truth. Catherine made her decision. The Princess of Wales would share the card with Charles and William, but she would not publish it in full. She would accept the responsibility without turning Elizabeth's words into a weapon. That choice offered the first path toward unity. But it came too late to stop the reaction already building outside Windsor. As Catherine chose restraint inside Windsor, the outside world turned Edward's declaration into the most emotionally charged royal story of the year. By sunrise, Edward's words belonged no longer to the family, but to the country. Broadcasters debated whether Catherine had become the late Queen's true emotional successor. Newspapers placed her image beside Elizabeth's, while crowds gathered with handwritten messages of support. Yet beneath the public fascination was a deeper hunger. People wanted proof that duty, restraint, and kindness still mattered inside a monarchy, increasingly defined by conflict. Buckingham Palace released a careful statement confirming that Edward had spoken from personal memory while refusing to discuss private correspondence connected to the late Queen. Private correspondence meant personal letters or notes never intended for ordinary public release. The wording was designed to calm speculation, but it did the opposite. The palace did not deny the card existed, and it did not challenge his account of Elizabeth's pride. The Daily Chronicle pushed the story further. Its front page placed Catherine beside Elizabeth during their final joint engagement beneath the headline, "The Queen's Choice of Heart." By midday, that phrase had spread across radio programs, television debates, and public conversations. It mattered because the story was no longer being framed as one brother remembering his mother. It had become a judgment about the monarchy's future character. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered near the gates. One handwritten sign read, "She earned it quietly." The message appeared repeatedly across evening broadcasts because it captured the public mood. People were not celebrating rank. They were responding to the idea that patience and compassion had finally been recognized. Catherine watched the coverage only briefly. The Princess of Wales switched off the television and told William that public affection became dangerous the moment a royal started believing it belonged to them. The prince understood her warning. But he also knew the country had already attached meaning to Edward's words that no official statement could remove. Charles felt the pressure deepen. The king heard commentators describe Catherine as the living continuation of his mother's values, while his own efforts to steady the crown were reduced to a passing line. Camilla felt the comparison too, yet she was moved when Catherine privately asked the communications team to stop presenting the story as one woman replacing another. The Queen Consort recognized that the younger royal was protecting her, even while receiving extraordinary praise. Edward then issued one controlled follow-up statement. The prince said his mother's pride in Catherine came from compassion under pressure, not rank, popularity, or future title. His clarification shifted the mood inside the palace. The praise was no longer a crown being passed from one woman to another. It was a standard being set for everyone. The public had already delivered its emotional verdict, but the monarchy itself still needed to decide whether Elizabeth's final confidence would unite the family or permanently divide it. Here is the concluding section with the hook and transition preserved exactly. The final meeting did not end with victory, punishment, or surrender. It ended with a family forced to confront what Queen Elizabeth had truly valued. Edward had broken his silence, but Catherine refused to turn his words into a crown of moral superiority. In doing so, she proved why the Queen had trusted her. The pride Elizabeth felt was never a reward. It was a burden, and Catherine finally chose to carry it. Charles, William, Catherine, Edward, Sophie, and Camilla, without aides, prepared statements, or an official record. That absence mattered, because nothing said in the room could be reshaped by competing households. A consultative role meant the right to offer judgment before a final decision, not the power to command the sovereign, and everyone understood that distinction before the card was opened. Edward placed the handwritten message at the center of the table, but asked Catherine to read it. The prince had guarded those words for years, yet he believed their meaning now belonged to the woman entrusted with their burden. Catherine hesitated, steadied herself, and began. She read Elizabeth's praise without changing her voice or placing extra weight on the lines naming her. Charles listened with visible discomfort. The king heard his mother's instruction that Catherine should be consulted during any crisis involving public confidence, meaning moments when the country's trust in the monarchy was at risk. Yet the note did not challenge his authority. It asked him to hear a perspective Elizabeth believed could protect the human heart of the crown. Camilla expected the message to create a moral victory she could never answer. Instead, Catherine turned toward the queen consort and said Elizabeth's trust must never be used to erase another woman's dignity or years of service. Camilla lowered her eyes, then thanked her. The rivalry others had tried to create lost its power in that single exchange. Charles accepted the arrangement. Catherine would be included in future discussions concerning the monarchy's emotional direction and public credibility. The agreement carried no constitutional force, but within the family it was clear, personal, and binding. Edward returned the card to Catherine. He admitted that silence had protected the message, but speaking had finally protected its meaning. William understood then that his wife's strength did not come from being praised above others. It came from refusing to profit from division. The palace later confirmed only that the family had resolved the matter privately and remained united. Edward offered no further revelation because his responsibility had ended. Elizabeth's pride had not crowned Catherine. It had recognized her as the monarchy's emotional safeguard, the person trusted to preserve duty without abandoning compassion. And so the sentence that threatened to divide the House of Windsor ultimately revealed the principle that could save it. The crown survives not through those who demand recognition, but through those who carry its heaviest burdens without using them against anyone else. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.